You didn't click this because you're fragile. You clicked because something inside you knows empath has been sweetened for public taste. The truth is darker. Jung warned that when a concept becomes popular, it's usually been stripped of its power. Today, empathy is sold as kindness, but the real empath, if unconscious, becomes a conduit, a lightning rod for other people's unprocessed shadow. That's why you feel heavy after rooms that looked harmless. That's why your mood turns without a reason you can name. The unconscious doesn't ring the doorbell. It walks through open walls. And most empaths were taught to live without walls. This isn't your fault. Your nervous system learned early to scan, to soften, to absorb. You called it compassion. Jung would call it an archetypal possession waiting to happen. Because what you carry is not only feelings, it's currents, ancestral grief, repressed rage, unlived lives hunting a host. That's why helping sometimes hollows you. That's why being needed can feel like a high and a hunger at once. If any of this is true for you, there's good news. Real, not romantic. Empathy doesn't need to be a sponge. It can become a vessel, porous yet discerning, warm with a spine. Over the next minutes, I'll show you what Jung pointed to but culture ignored. How to name what enters you, contain what is yours, and return what is not, so your gift stops bleeding and starts transmuting. And that's where the truth begins. Most empaths don't realize how early the training began. As a child, you probably sensed tension before words were spoken. You learned to read faces, to predict anger, to comfort before anyone asked. You thought it was love, but it was survival. Every sigh in the room became your responsibility. Every silence, a storm you had to calm. That's how the body learns to confuse peace with vigilance. And why, even now, you can't tell whether you're feeling your pain or someone else's. The world praises empathy, but it doesn't carry its weight. People admire your sensitivity until it stops serving them. They call you selfless, then drain you dry. They say, "You're so understanding," while unloading everything they can't hold. And you absorb it, because somewhere inside, you fear that saying no means becoming cold. But Jung warned that the unconscious seeks balance through excess. What begins as compassion soon mutates into compulsion, the need to fix, to rescue, to heal what was never yours to heal. That's how the empath becomes haunted. You feel sadness that doesn't belong to you, anger that rises out of nowhere, exhaustion that sleep can't fix. You carry ghosts that never even knew your name. And still, you tell yourself, "This is my purpose." But no soul was meant to be the landfill of the collective. If you've ever wondered why you attract the broken, the chaotic, the ones who drain your peace, it's not a curse, it's a mirror. Your gift is powerful, but power without awareness always turns against itself. Empathy without boundaries isn't a virtue, it's slow possession. If this message meant something to you, subscribe and stay. Your presence truly matters here. Because the truth is this: feeling deeply isn't what breaks you. What breaks you is believing that every ache inside you demands repair. Some emotions are invitations, others are warnings. The art is knowing which is which, and that's where the unraveling begins, when you finally question what was ever truly yours to carry. Carl Jung once said that the unconscious is a sea in which all of us swim, but only a few realize they are underwater. The empath is one of those few, aware of every current, yet unaware that most of it is not their own. When Jung spoke of empathy, he didn't mean politeness or social grace. He meant a psychic function, the permeability of the human soul. To feel another's energy is not magic. It's biology touched by spirit. But when it happens without awareness, empathy becomes infection. You might believe you're compassionate because you can sense pain, but sensing is not the same as seeing. Jung taught that when you feel something that doesn't belong to you, the first question must be, whose shadow is this? Because every feeling carries lineage. What you think is sadness may be your mother's uncried tears. What you think is guilt may be generations of repression moving through your nervous system like an inheritance. The empath without discernment becomes a museum of other people's ghosts. I once worked with a woman who cried every morning before she could even open her eyes. She wasn't clinically depressed, she was spiritually overloaded. Over time, we discovered she had been carrying the unexpressed sorrow of her mother, her grandmother, and a line of women forbidden to cry. Her tears were never just her own. They were ancestral. That is the secret danger Jung warned of. Empathy becomes a vessel for what the collective refuses to feel. So when you walk into a room and suddenly feel grief or anger or shame for no reason, pause. You are not crazy, you are tuned in. But tuning in without grounding is like walking barefoot through fire and calling it faith. Empathy is not about absorbing, it's about witnessing. The difference between the unconscious empath and the conscious one is a single word: ownership. When you claim what's yours and release what's not, empathy transforms. It stops being pain in transit and becomes light in translation. But here's the strange part. The deeper you know yourself, the less of others you carry, and the more clearly you begin to see the world's true shape. Empathy becomes dangerous the moment it forgets its own origin. Jung warned that archetypes, those ancient psychic forces older than language, do not die. They simply wait for a host. The empath, if unconscious, becomes that host. You begin to carry not just the emotions of people, but the archetypal dramas that live inside them. The victim seeking rescue, the mother desperate to save, the martyr who finds purpose in pain. These energies are not metaphors. They are living patterns that slip through the cracks of your compassion and wear your name like a mask. At first, it feels noble. You become the helper, the healer, the one everyone turns to when their world collapses. But slowly, something shifts. The help becomes a habit. The healing becomes hunger. You start to feel alive only when someone else is broken. That is not empathy anymore. That is possession wearing perfume. Jung called this the wounded healer complex. When your value becomes tied to suffering itself, the more you fix, the more you disappear. The empath begins to dissolve, not from lack of love, but from loving unconsciously. I once heard a patient describe it perfectly. She said, "It's like I've built a temple out of other people's pain, and now I'm the one who has to worship there." That's what happens when empathy turns compulsive. You don't heal others, you host them. Their shadows find shelter in your nervous system, and you call it connection. But the unconscious is clever. It will keep feeding you the same lesson until you learn its language. Every exhaustion, every heartbreak, every person who takes too much, they're not punishments. They're invitations to wake up. To remember that empathy without boundaries isn't holiness. It's self-erasure. And when you finally see that, a strange calm arrives. Because awareness ends the spell. The archetype loses its grip the moment you call it by name. Stay with me. What comes next is the vessel code most empaths never learn. And that's where the truth begins. The moment you realize that to carry everything is not compassion, it's amnesia. Imagine holding a bowl carved from obsidian. It's smooth, dark, cool against your palms. You pour water into it. Light flickers across the surface, but the bowl stays whole. That is the difference between a vessel and a sponge. A vessel holds what enters. A sponge becomes what it touches. Most empaths have been taught to absorb, to soak, to merge, to fix by feeling. But the psyche was never designed to be porous without form. Even sacred water needs a cup. Jung believed that the self, when conscious, becomes that cup, a container for the fire of experience. Without it, the same light that guides you will burn you alive. The empath who learns containment does not numb out. They stay open, but structured. They can feel the grief of another without drowning in it, hear a cry without becoming the echo. Because empathy is not meant to erase the boundary, it's meant to refine it. The vessel doesn't resist what it holds. It simply knows when to pour it back. Picture this. You walk into a crowded room, hundreds of emotions swirling like weather. Instead of absorbing the storm, you become the eye of it. Still, steady, aware. You sense the sadness in the corner, the tension in the air, the joy that hums between strangers. You feel it all, yet none of it sticks. The feelings move through you like wind through glass. You no longer sponge, you distill. The vessel empath breathes differently. They practice discernment like prayer. They ask, "What enters me now?" They pause before saying yes. They learn that boundaries are not walls, but rims, the sacred edges that make compassion sustainable. Because love without form always becomes flood. If you can hold another's sorrow without owning it, if you can witness pain without dissolving, you've already begun the alchemy. Empathy becomes the fire that illuminates rather than consumes. And that's where the shift happens. When you stop proving your kindness by bleeding and start expressing it by staying whole. When you finally stop absorbing, something unexpected appears. A mirror. For the first time, you see the person behind the sensitivity. The self that existed before the world taught you to feel for survival. Jung said that meeting the self is both revelation and terror. Because when you stop being everyone's mirror, you're forced to see your own reflection, unfiltered, unperformed, alive. The empath often hides behind kindness because it's safer than honesty. But solitude has a way of stripping performance from the soul. You begin to notice the quiet addictions that empathy once disguised. The high of being needed. The subtle pride of being the one who understands. The pleasure of being essential. These are the shadow motives empathy conceals. And confronting them is liberation, not shame. Because what the unconscious hides in virtue, it later reveals as truth. You were never just kind. You were craving connection. You weren't only generous. You were avoiding the silence of your own unmet needs. Seeing this doesn't make you cruel. It makes you real. This is the moment the mirror turns clear. The empath stops chasing reflections of wholeness in others and begins to polish the glass within. You start asking quieter questions. What is mine to carry? What is mine to feel? What must I finally release? Every honest answer pulls your power back from the people and patterns that once drained you. When you live from that mirror, empathy matures. It stops being a reaction and becomes recognition. You feel not to rescue, but to remember. And in that remembering, you meet the one person empathy was meant to reveal all along, yourself. And that's where the truth begins. The moment you realize that reflection, not rescue, was always your real gift. For years, you were taught that love meant merging, that to care was to carry, that saying no was the opposite of compassion. But that language was written by those who feared boundaries. Jung warned that the collective often glorifies the very traits that keep individuals unconscious. That's why the empath was praised for disappearing, for bleeding gracefully, for calling collapse devotion. But to awaken, you must rewrite that vocabulary from the inside out. Begin here. Replace absorb with witness. Replace help with hold. Replace save with see. These are not semantic shifts. They are psychic ones. To witness someone's pain without absorbing it is not coldness. It's mastery. To hold space without trying to fix is not detachment. It's respect. To see another clearly without turning their wounds into your purpose, that's love with integrity. This is what Jung called the integration of opposites, the marriage of heart and spine. The conscious empath learns a new syntax of presence. They say, I feel you, but I am not you. They learn to stand beside suffering, not inside it. They replace rescuing with resonance, listening without losing center. And strangely, from that steadiness, a different kind of compassion is born, one that heals without hollowing. But beware, every language carries its own shadow. The moment you believe you've transcended pain, the magician archetype awakens, the part of you that uses insight as armor, wisdom as superiority. Jung saw this too. Enlightenment can become ego in disguise, so stay humble. Let empathy remain an instrument, not an identity. The empath's new power isn't to feel everything, but to choose what deserves to stay. Boundaries are not barriers. They are sentences with punctuation, the pauses that make meaning clear. Without them, every story collapses into noise. This is where love evolves. It stops being a sacrifice and becomes clarity. You learn that the purest form of empathy is not absorption, but awareness with edges. And here's your quiet warning. If you forget those edges, the world will take your warmth and leave you the ashes. So guard your fire with grace, not guilt. Empathy without practice is chaos. So here's where awareness becomes ritual. Jung believed that transformation is born not from ideas, but from repetition, small, conscious acts that remind the psyche it is safe to change. Start with 3. Name, contain, return, name. When emotion enters, ask softly, is this mine? If the answer feels heavy, breathe once and call it by its source, hers, his, theirs. Naming separates compassion from contamination. Contain. Place a hand over your chest. Feel the weight of what remains. Imagine it sitting in a vessel within you, solid, luminous, unbroken. Inhale through your nose for 4, hold for 6, exhale for 8. Let your breath rebuild the rim that keeps you whole. Return. When you sense you've carried enough, whisper, I release what's not mine. Picture it flowing back to the earth, to the collective, to whatever mystery can hold it better than you. This is not detachment. It's devotion with discernment. And that's where empathy becomes discipline, not a flood, but a form. Every empath pays a price before they awaken. You lose yourself in others, mistake exhaustion for purpose, call depletion destiny. The world applauds your selflessness while quietly consuming it. Jung warned that any light, when unconscious, becomes its own shadow. And for the empath, that shadow is martyrdom. You love until it hurts, and then you call the hurt proof that it's real. But love that destroys its source is not sacred. It's survival wearing a halo. The cost of staying unconscious is subtle. You begin to vanish by degrees. Your laughter sounds borrowed. Your opinions fade. You say, "It's fine," when it's not. Because the unconscious empath believes peace is maintained through silence. But peace built on self-abandonment always collapses. The truth is this: empathy without self-awareness isn't kindness. It's leakage. Every yes spoken from guilt drains the current that was meant to heal you first. When you finally stop performing goodness and start practicing truth, everything changes. You begin to love from fullness instead of fear. You realize that compassion doesn't require you to disappear. It requires you to be real enough to stay visible. Boundaries stop feeling cruel. They start feeling sacred. You see that your sensitivity was never the problem. The absence of structure was. The return of your energy is not dramatic. It's quiet. You wake up one morning, breathe, and realize your body no longer feels like an emergency. You look in the mirror and see color where gray used to live. That's what happens when empathy matures into consciousness. The world stops being heavier than you. Have you ever felt that shift? The moment you stopped absorbing and started witnessing. Share one line below. Someone reading might need your reminder. Because that's the secret Jung left us. Feeling deeply was never the wound. It was the doorway. And that's where the truth begins. When you finally understand that saving yourself was the most healing act of all. When the noise fades and night begins to settle, there comes a stillness only the conscious empath can understand. You no longer walk into rooms scanning for pain. You no longer mistake being needed for being loved. The silence that once frightened you now feels like a sanctuary, a cathedral built from your own clarity. Jung called this state individuation, the soul returning to itself, whole after centuries of scattering. You don't need to fix the world anymore. You simply need to stay awake in it. Now, when you meet suffering, you don't rush to soothe it. You witness. You listen. You let it pass through without making it yours. Because compassion isn't drowning with the drowning. It's learning to stand still, so others remember the shore. You walk lighter, not because the world has softened, but because you finally stopped carrying what was never yours. There's one last image I want to leave you with. Imagine a lake at dawn, silver, still, infinite. You stand beside it, no longer as a sponge, but as a vessel, quiet, intact, alive. The sky trembles on its surface. When others look into your eyes now, they don't see their wounds. They see what they could become. That is the gift of the awakened empath, to mirror not pain, but possibility. Tonight before you sleep, whisper, "What is mine to feel, and what is mine to release?" Let that question guide you back to yourself. Leave the light on, not for anyone else, but for the home within you that finally knows peace.